Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. My name is Stephen Kotkin, and I'm the director of the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. I'm also a professor of Russian and Soviet history here at Princeton with a joint appointment in our policy school. I have the high honor of introducing His Excellency Ambassador D.B. Venkatesh Varma, Ambassador of India to the Russian Federation, who has graciously agreed to spend time today with our audience, especially with our students. Rather than a lengthy introduction for the ambassador, I'm going to ask the ambassador to tell us about himself and about how he got a career in the diplomatic service, who his mentors were, who his guiding North Star was, as it were, as he embarked on this career and advanced through various different posts, to launch our conversation today by describing for us a little bit about how he came to be in that august chair in Moscow that we see him sitting in today, Ambassador of India to the Russian Federation. One note on procedure, the ambassador and I will have a series of questions and answers for the first half hour of our event today. We will then invite the students on the screen who are part of the Zoom to unmute and to launch their videos, and we'll have student Q&A for the rest of the time. And those people who are not on the screen but are participating in the webinar are invited to introduce your questions using the chat function, which you'll see down below. Whether we get to all your questions or not, I'm not sure, but we welcome them, and please put them in the chat. And please, of course, we're always civil and respectful. Okay, Ambassador, thank you so much for being here today. It really is a great honor for us. And please tell us a little bit about your career trajectory as I prompted.
Professor Kotkin, warm greetings from Moscow. It's 7 in the evening. It's a warm, late October, 7 degrees centigrade, which is, I think, 45. A great honor to be part of this video exercise with you and with your students. As I'm about to complete my tenure here in Moscow as India's ambassador. I've been in Russia twice before, at the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union between 1990 and 92, and again between 2000 and 2003, when, in fact, many of you would recall that President Putin first became president. And I've been here for the last 3 years as India's ambassador to Moscow. The world is divided into two halves. The Kotkin world, I would say, those who have read Volume 1 first, and those who have read Volume 2 later, and the reverse. And I must confess that I read Volume 2 before I picked up Volume 1, and whether that's a sign of improvement of your writing skills or whether Stalin himself as a character evolved, that we can discuss later. Diplomacy is a profession. It's a professional career. Like all other careers, you probably require an inclination, an opportunity, and I guess some level of competence. Of course, nobody is born a diplomat. You can train yourself to be a diplomat. It requires skills, just like any other profession requires skills. But being a diplomat, of course, requires some specific skills. The ability to relate to other countries, other people, other cultures, other ideas, a certain amount of empathy for what is foreign to you, what is not familiar to you in the first instance, a diligence with facts, the ability to draw patterns and trends. And therefore, I think in our profession, it is not very dissimilar to what you do as in the academia, as professors or as students. So I think the empathy point, I think, is hugely important. Of course, all of us may have illusions. I think many diplomats carry the secret desire to be mini Kissingers in their time. The real world of diplomacy is very different, definitely for lesser mortals. It requires a daily grind of looking at things that you are not familiar with, making sense of them. And of course, the guiding principle, the North Star, as you call it, is of course your own national interest. Finally, we are diplomats for our respective countries. I represent India's interests here. I project them. I seek to promote them, find common ground where disagreements occur. We need to sort them out and move on in a very complex world that becomes not only difficult but hugely exciting. So here we are, and I'm very glad to join you today, along with your students and others who've joined us. We are actually quite delighted. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ambassador. Let's begin with describing, from your point of view, the current state of India-Russia relations. And if you could talk about what the accomplishments have been, what are the areas of disappointment for you, and also how you might foresee the next 5 or 10 years in India-Russia relations?
Well, India and Russia are almost frozen in warm friendship for almost 70 years, which is quite unique amongst relations amongst nations. We didn't begin quite so actively. We became independent in 1947. Prime Minister Nehru chose his sister to be the first ambassador of India to the Soviet Union. She came here to Moscow. Stalin wouldn't see her. She left Moscow without having a call on Stalin. The next ambassador was a professor from Oxford, a great professor who eventually became the president of India, Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. And why Prime Minister Nehru chose a scholar on Orientalism and Oriental philosophy, so to speak, to the most materialistic capital in the world is something, again, is something that to be pondered on. But the first major call of an Indian ambassador with Stalin was the 17th of February. And Stalin received him at 8 o'clock in the evening. The ambassador had 3 days advance notice to seek instructions from capital. Stalin walked across his room, the small corner room, as has been so vividly described in your writings, met him halfway and said, "Stalin." That's how he introduced himself. I sat down, dwindled with his red and green and blue pencils, and asked a series of questions. The first question he asked was is India truly an independent country? Are you like Canada? Are you a dominion of the British Empire? Do you have an army? What is the basis of the creation of Pakistan? Is it religion, or is it language? And he was prescient enough to say that countries that are built on religions don't last for long. So we began on a rather cold, lukewarm note. But just as the Soviet Union was liberated from Stalinism, and we had just emerged into the Comity of Free Nations, India and Russia warmed up, India and Soviet Union warmed up pretty much in the mid-1950s. And it's been a story of solid friendship ever since. The reasons are, I think, quite clear. Firstly, we don't have a conflict of interest. We've never had a conflict of interest. I think not being neighbors and sharing a common close geographical space, I guess, helps. In fact, we've had a convergence of interests across various periods to the Cold War period, after the Cold War period, and of course in the last 20 years. Prime Minister Modi and President Putin enjoy an extremely close relationship. Our relationship is formally called a Special and Privileged Strategic Partnership. What it means in simple words is that we get along well with each other. We are proud of each other's success. Each other has never really dealt with an issue that has caused harm or conflict with the other side. There are key drivers of cooperation, and these drivers of cooperation lead to results that are whose impact is measured not in months and years, but in decades. So it's long-term, it's deep, there's a lot of convergence of interest. And this is all backed up, I think, not just an engagement at the leadership and the government level, but there's a very popular sentiment both in India and in Russia. It's a little fuzzy, sentiment is still important. I think this is what keeps us going. What are the shortfalls? I presume the lack of new dynamism in our economic and trade relations for a country of India's size and Russia's potential. We hover around $11 billion. The United States trade with Russia is $20 billion, despite all the sanctions. The Russian trade with China is about $120 billion, poised to grow to about $200 billion by in the next 2-3 years. Of course, they are neighbors, and connectivity is a problem for us in a more acute sense than for other countries. But I think my own guess is that with the advent of globalization, India and Russia were similar in the sense that we embraced globalization in the early 90s. And the middle class that has been produced both in India and Russia actually looks to the West and or other regions of growth and not towards each other. But that does not preclude the fact that Russia is still one of our biggest defense partners. Russia gives weapons to India that it doesn't give to any other country. 60 to 80% of our armed forces are with Russian origin equipment. Russia supports our indigenization program, so to speak, the Make in India program. There are more and more equipment that are manufactured in India with Russian assistance. How do we see the future? I think Russia and India have a common interest in handling the challenges that are now slowly engulfing the Eurasian land space, which is something familiar to you. Russia has dealt it with in its own way. India has done so in the past, but I think if you look at the example of what has happened, the implosion of American power in Afghanistan and the vacuum that is created will have repercussions in the broader Eurasian continent. And so Eurasian continental security is something that India and Russia will have to grapple together. The rise of China, of course, is an obvious fact. But there are other peripheries of interest that would impact on our relations, if not directly. The new assertiveness of Turkey in the Caspian Sea area, in the Black Sea area, Nagorno-Karabakh and the Caucasus are sort of alive again. So Russia, in a sense, is returning to some of the problems that it had last century. And if you look at the problems that they have in the Black Sea area, they're not very similar to what was faced by Catherine the Great almost 250, 300 years ago. India, for its part, has other challenges, but there are some commonalities, and I think common challenges are the best focus for India and Russia to handle. Climate change, we are big consumers of fossil fuels. We need to adapt. India is well ahead in this process. Russia too has changed. In the last 6 months, Russia is now engaging much more with climate change challenge than in the past. It has given a commitment of net zero emissions around 2060. Energy is another area. counterterrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, migration, water, agriculture. Russia today is a major agricultural superpower. It exports more agricultural products than it does arms, actually. The popular perception is that Russia is a very major arms exporter, which it is, but arms exports were just $15 billion last year. It exported $30 billion of agricultural produce. And as the climate change impacts on Russia, as much as it impacts in the rest of the world, a lot of the agricultural produce will come from regions that are getting warmer and warmer. And there's no shortage of water in Russia. So for a country of India's size, where we have a growing population, I think agriculture too is another area. Finance, new technologies and who makes rules on how new technologies are governed is another area of conversation. So the list can go on. But essentially, it's a very happy story, and I'm happy I've presided over a relationship that has only grown stronger in the last 3 years.
Thank you, Ambassador. Very comprehensive in a short period of time. I want to talk about India's place in the world more generally, but before we get to that, maybe we could talk about India's bilateral relations, first with the US and then with China, and then we can open up more generally to India's place in the world over the next 10 years or so. So what do you think have been the key drivers of US-India relations? Is the bilateral relationship as strong as it could be? How might it be strengthened? And do you see any major pitfalls in the US-India relationship today?
Well, our relations with the United States have undergone a dramatic transformation in the last 2 decades. At the turn of the century, there were instances where the United States looked at India in a manner that didn't create space for the expansion of the relationship. But since then, I think one of the most dramatic transformations in India's foreign policy has been the deepening and the widening of our engagement with the United States, largely driven by the fact that we have shared values, 2 large democracies. Our economic congruence and convergences are very, very strong. They have new drivers within these convergences. Energy, international security, climate change. Presidential envoy John Kerry was in India twice this year, and of course the fact that American universities host several thousand Indian students who do exceedingly well. There's a very strong, productive, and active diaspora, which is a great asset for the relationship. These are the drivers, and I think there's also finally, after a lapse of several decades, there is now emerging new convergence on the emerging geopolitical challenges. That said, that creates room for dialogue, that creates room for engagement. Prime Minister Modi was recently in Washington for a bilateral summit, as well as a new formation, a new grouping called the Quad, which includes the United States, Australia, Japan, and India. They have a series of issues on which they are engaging, including the COVID pandemic, infrastructure, new technologies, cooperation amongst the youth. So this is an expanding format of cooperation. India and the United States can do much more, provided there is a further fine-tuning of convergence of interests. The United States has a number of allies and partners across the world, but India is quite unique and very different from the other friends that it has. So I think the United States needs to find new frameworks, and I'm sure it will, of dealing with India. India is not an insignificant country. India has a mind of its own. India often stands on its own feet, but that doesn't mean that India is not interested in engagement. We are, and we've shown that across the board. So I would say that we have a very positive assessment of India-US relations going forward.
Thank you, Ambassador. A challenge to our establishment to understand India better in the terms of improving the bilateral relationship mutually. Tell us a little bit about what India hopes and expects from China. Is India managing its relationship with China right now, in your estimation? And can we see a lasting modus vivendi achieved between these two great Asian powers?
Well, China's rise and its new style of engaging with the world has been noticed not just by India, but by its other neighbors and more broadly across the globe. Of course, China is a major Asian country. It's a major global power, a member of the Security Council, very robust economic growth that has been witnessed over the last 30 years. Now a growing military power. Where it has been a huge beneficiary of the system of globalization that has been put in place for the last 2 or 3 decades. Being a beneficiary, I think, also requires a contribution to the global system to sustain it, not seek unilateral advantage, not have issues decided by assertion of the use of threat of force, and a general respect for international law and the international rules of conduct. That said, every country, including India, has an engagement with China. We have a large trade relationship. There are, of course, concerns on the one-sided nature of the trade relationship. We also have concerns with respect to the technologies that are embedded in Chinese exports and services. There's room for dialogue. But most importantly, in the case of India, we have a border problem, difficulties of delineating a border that has been in dispute ever since India became independent in 1947. The great difference between China and India is that in 1947, when we became independent, we inherited boundaries that were bequeathed to us by British India. And by and large, India has respected that as a measure of our respect for international law. China has never defined its boundaries. It's been an expanding notion of its territorial claims, where it has settled border disputes with other neighbors. It has settled when it sort of secured an advantage. Well, it may do that with others, but I guess it would need to try for very long. It would not have similar luck with India. India will stand up for its version of what our belief of where the boundary lies. We are interested in a negotiated settlement through dialogue. We've had several mechanisms for over several decades looking at this issue. But last year's events in Ladakh, which is a part of India, where there was an unusual tendency on part of China to mass troops, very large numbers, and seek to change the status quo on the ground through the use of force or the threat of use of force, which is, of course, completely unacceptable to us or to the international community. So that's where we stand. We are open for the settlement of the border problem through dialogue. our approach is not very dissimilar to what other major players, including the United States or the European Union or Russia for that matter, where we have issues of cooperation, common interest. We of course are open to taking it forward. But in the case of India, this cannot be business as usual as long as there's de-escalation and disengagement on the border has not been accomplished. India and China also cooperate in several multilateral fora. We are part of BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, including the G20. We are presently members of the Security Council. We have good cooperation there. But India will stand its ground. And therefore, if we look at new patterns of cooperation that are emerging in our part of the world, the Indo-Pacific is one instance, the Quad is another. These are all efforts by India to create space. Much as we like a multipolar world, we are equally opposed to a unipolar Asia, and we are not alone. That is the view that is shared by the ASEAN, and I'm sure that's the view from Russia as well.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let's close this opening part of our program by talking about what's shaping India's foreign policy today and going forward, and how you see India's place in the world evolving over the next decade. I should note that in the chat, we do have a question about India's historical policy of non-alignment, in this case specifically vis-a-vis Russia. And do you think India does remain and will remain non-aligned going forward, or are there other ways we can understand India's role in the world going forward?
Well, non-alignment is both a prescription for individual or a national foreign policy, but for non-alignment can also be a collective movement. Non-alignment had its day during the period of the Cold War, when it was felt by countries such as India to create space for themselves and not be caught up in the tight embrace of a bipolar world and having to choose between one bloc or the other. I think it played a role in its time. We are definitely moving towards a multipolar world. We saw a fleeting movement, a decade of unipolarity when American primacy was practically uncontested in the 1990s. But that moment is past, both by design and by default. New powers have emerged. The United States has not been able to make full use of the opportunity of the decade that the 1990s provided. And you have examples all over in the Middle East, in Asia, definitely in Europe, and you see that very often in discussions in Moscow, where many of the issues of contention that are presently discussed can always be traced back to what countries did or did not do in the 1990s. Now, the concept of multipolarity is that, we definitely see ourselves as one of the poles. The concept of multipolarity, of course, requires flexibility, but no exclusivity. We would engage with all the major players. India has excellent relations, not just with Russia and the United States, but with the European Union, with France, with the United Kingdom, with Japan, with Egypt, with ASEAN, with South Africa. We would seek such good relations with China, but for reasons that I've explained, that is a matter for the future. So the original rationale of non-alignment was that you would create and retain space for yourself. I think Indian foreign policy has moved beyond that. I think it's a more proactive foreign policy. we are reaching out not just in the context of avoiding entanglement with blocs. That remains the case. India has never been a member of an alliance, and I would find it difficult to believe that it would do so in the future. But that, short of that, I think we seek every form of engagement. India's capacity and willingness to engage with global issues has increased dramatically, which is, of course, natural. We are a $3 trillion economy, a booming middle class, expected to grow at 8 to 10% for the next decade or so. And we are slowly emerging as one of the key drivers of not just global growth, but of innovation, of technology as a source and as an aggregator of international support for addressing global challenges, and climate change is something that I've already mentioned. So as an analytical concept, I think non-alignment had its specific historic context. As an instrument of policy, it is probably now too restrictive for India's needs and ambitions. And in any case, the world has changed. The world today is quite unrecognizable to what we saw in the last century.
Thank you, Ambassador. At this point, I'd like to ask our student participants to turn their videos on. Thank you. And we'll now have the students pose questions. And when I call on you, please unmute, ask your question, and then remute so that we can hear the ambassador well. I'm going to call on Michaela first, please. Please introduce yourself in terms of what you study and what year you are so the ambassador can understand, and then pose your question. And please, let's keep the questions brief enough so the ambassador can answer them.
Hello, Ambassador. It's an honor to be able to partake in this panel with you. My name is Michaela. I'm currently calling from Yerevan, Armenia. I am a sophomore at Princeton, and I'm studying French conjoined with public policy. My question is with regard to Armenia-India relations. I realize that the Indian Prime Minister was recently received in Yerevan on October 13th. There was discussion of enhancing trade, education, and cultural ties in Armenia. At the forefront of that discussion, however, was the Chabahar port. I was wondering if you could shed light on this and perhaps elaborate on India's posture with regard to this gateway being constructed in the wake of Pakistan denying transit to New Delhi. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And, Armenian restaurants in Moscow are one of the more popular set of restaurants. So our foreign minister was there in Yerevan. It was not our prime minister. And it was an extremely successful visit, which built upon the bonds of friendship that we've enjoyed for long. There has been an Armenian diaspora in India. For long, we have stood by each other in international fora, especially on issues that have been of concern to Armenia. Our foreign minister, Dr. Jaishankar's visit to Yerevan comes against the background of recent events in the last few months, which impacted on the issue of relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, especially in the context of the Nagorno-Karabakh issue. But there was a settlement, even if it's a temporary settlement, which was facilitated by Russia, and there are Russian peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh. And as part of the settlement, there was an understanding that certain transit and transportation routes would be opened up. Now, that opens up Armenia's link to the Caspian Sea. India has attached great importance to what is called the International North-South Corridor, it's INSTC. where basically it is where we see Iran as the place where shipping containers, say from India or from Southeast Asia, would land up. And the two ports, Bandar Abbas being the older and the more congested port, and the new port of Chabahar, which is quite near to the Afghan border, and it was built initially with the intention that we would extend a lot of humanitarian and trade cooperation with Afghanistan. Of course, things have changed now, but that creates a very good opportunity to use the route through Iran, enter Armenia through the new routes that are opening up, and connect to the Russian and the European rail network. This is of high importance to us, especially since Pakistan, as you know, doesn't allow land transit between India and Pakistan. And that's been closed for several decades now. So connectivity, as we call it, is a major issue for India, a major priority. And we would be very happy to take along our relations with Armenia to see how, and this is something that would be beneficial to Armenia itself. And we very much hope that in addition to the excellent relations that we enjoy both with the government and the people of Armenia, these practical areas of cooperation will add new strength to our bilateral relations.
Thank you so much. Now we'll have Manaf.
Good evening, Ambassador. It's an honor to speak with you. I'm a fifth-year student at the history department. I actually had a question about the relationship between India and Russia vis-a-vis both China and Pakistan. You spoke about the historical convergence rather than conflict between both countries, between India and Russia. But how does China's increasing closeness to and trade with Russia make a difference to this, if it does? Also, how does the rise of the Quad affect the earlier relationship that India has had with Brazil, Russia, and China and South Africa, the BRICS forum?
Russia and China enjoy very good relations. They do so for the last 20 years. This is the first time in history of more than probably 300 years that this present state of relations exists. And largely it's been the result of very purposeful diplomacy by Russia under President Putin. But I think the foundation for that was laid when China, Deng Xiaoping, told Gorbachev in 1989 that while, of course, China's claim is really until the Urals, we will not claim it for the time being, broadly along those lines. So I think it was the Chinese, for whatever reason, and there can be several reasons for that, took away the most important impediment to relations between Russia and China. The Chinese were initially petrified by the nature of the Soviet collapse. They studied it very well, and they, in their view, imbibed certain lessons. The last 2 decades of relations between Russia and China have been made possible because the power differential between Russia and China has remained within a certain band. And that power differential will increase as we move along. So this notion that Russia and China are partners and will be alliance members, it's a complete myth. It's an easy, lazy generalization that comes about in newspapers and things like that, sometimes by purpose. President Putin spoke at the Wildlife Club event in Sochi, and I would encourage you to have a look at his remarks. And he clearly said Russia and China are not an alliance. Russia will never be a junior partner to China. And as the power differential increases, Russia will need to find a new equilibrium that will be quite dissimilar to what was sustained in the last 20 years. But that is not unique to Russia itself. I mean, every country in the world, every major country in the world will be engaged in a similar exercise, given the nature of China's rise. And that applies to India, that applies to the United States. And there's a very active debate in the United States on precisely how to relate to this challenge. Russia's relations with Pakistan are very limited compared to what relations they have with India. They have not supplied major weapon systems to Pakistan almost since 1969. And presently, Russia does not supply arms to Pakistan. Russia does engage with Pakistan, especially with relation to counterterrorism issues and the current situation in Afghanistan. Those are tactical convergences and very dissimilar to the more sustained and persistent and deeper convergences that we've witnessed between India and Russia. So I don't think the factor of Pakistan is an issue between Russia and India. How does Russia see the Quad formations and groupings such as this? Of course, Russia watches these developments closely. We have a constant dialogue with them. I don't think Russia sees this as particularly directed against them. In fact, the Quad is not directed against any country. Russia, I guess, has no objection, would have no reasonable objection to the current areas of cooperation between the Quad members. But Russia does take issue with the militarization of relations both in Europe and in the Asia Pacific. But if you see, or the Indo-Pacific as we call it, but if you study Russia's reaction to the recent announcement of what is called the AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom, and the United States, where the Australians are to be provided with nuclear-powered submarines to increase their defense capabilities vis-a-vis China. Russian reaction has been fairly moderate. Of course, they are concerned, but there has been no indication that Russia wants to carry China's can. So there are a lot of nuances. And this has not prevented very active cooperation in BRICS, something that you referred to. We also engage with respect to SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So I would say that all the major powers are never fixated on one problem. They see a problem, they wish to address it, they wish to insulate it, they wish to dilute or deflect it. But I think none of the major powers have the luxury of fulminating on a particular issue at the expense of so many other issues that are taking place. There's a great flux in the international system, and you require every avenue of cooperation and engagement. And you cannot have the luxury like the two big powers had during the Cold War of defining the world in your own image. Here, the world is defining itself by the sheer diffusion of power, of new technologies, of new societal forces, of the youth, the great democratization that has taken place through the digital sphere, social media. You want the world as you would like to sort of design it or conceive it. It's no longer possible, both internally and externally. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll go to Sam next. In the interest of allowing all students to pose their question, we limit to one per student. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for your really insightful remarks. You mentioned previously an object of intense strategic concern for both India and Russia, Afghanistan. So I'm curious, in what areas does India seek to cooperate with Russia on Afghanistan? And how does India look at Russia and other strategic partners such as Uzbekistan and Iran's willingness to engage with the new government in Kabul?
Yeah, India has had a slightly different approach on Afghanistan for several years now. And our interests are seen primarily taking into account what is in the best interest of the Afghan people. India was not part of the Doha process. The Doha process was taken forward by the United States and the Taliban last year. We were not part of the Troika Plus process, which includes the United States, China, Russia, and Pakistan, which tried, in retrospect, unsuccessfully to convince the Taliban for a power-sharing arrangement in Kabul. None of that took place. You have the Taliban today in almost full control, and their inclination or their necessity or requirement to share power is, of course, rather limited. In these circumstances, well, there is also a humanitarian crisis that is brewing in Afghanistan. The middle class that was, in a sense, generated through international exposure and engagement over the last 2 decades is under grave threat, including as a way of life, not just in terms of democratic values and openness and rights of women and children and girls and so on and so forth. So there is a problem. But India has reached out. We were part of the recently held Moscow format meeting that took place just a week ago, which involved regional countries, including India, to have a first phase of engagement with the Taliban. The Taliban is also, in a sense, reaching out. Obviously, they're interested in recognition and financial support. But the international community has said that this would be forthcoming if there are certain standards that would be met by the Taliban, which I think is a reasonable expectation. Whatever it is, I think both Russia and India, whatever the debris of conflict that has been left behind, we belong to the region. We need to deal with it. Whether we were part or not part of the events that led to the very sad turn of events in August and September this year. Drug trafficking, the presence of international terror groups, the possibility of the return of safe havens for terror groups, and these are all familiar themes relating to Afghanistan. So we remain engaged. Russia is one of our main interlocutors, but we have similar dialogues with other players, including those from the Gulf, with Iran, with the United States of America, with the European Union, at the United Nations. So this is, I think, an ongoing process. There are no easy solutions, but I think persistence is something that is required.
Thank you so much. And Alika?
Sure. Again, I would like to echo the gratitude on behalf of my Princeton colleagues. It's been certainly a privilege to hear from you, Ambassador. My question was actually in part already asked by Sam, but I was hoping if you could speak in the context of Afghanistan and applying it to the North Caucasus. I know you've just spoken about the South Caucasus with Michaela's question, but as we know, the Taliban in 2000 was one of the few actors that recognized secessionist Chechnya. And I'm just wondering, how is that history of Russia with Afghanistan really resonating in terms of Indian-Russian relations today? I know you spoke briefly about this already, but if there's any resonance of that North Caucasian history that doesn't make an impact, I'm wondering if you could speak on that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, one of the main changes that happened in the last 20 years is the North Caucasus, Chechnya, Ingushetia, Dagestan, have in a sense settled down, so to speak, into a stability and development that was not seen in the 1990s. Grozny today is quite unrecognizable from what it was in the 1990s. Russia, of course, went through a very difficult period. So did the Chechen people and the people from Ingushetia, the North Caucasus, as you call them. But I think that stability is of primary importance to Russia. Russia would not like to see a return to the absolute mayhem and chaos that was created, not just by the presence of armed groups, militants and terror groups in Chechnya, but also around which created the basis for external intervention. Russia continues to be concerned about the presence of a number of groups related to Chechen groups, terror groups, as they call them, and their presence in Afghanistan. And Russia is not alone. There are armed opposition Islamic groups from the Islamic opposition from several of the Central Asian states. There are groups from that are related to the Uyghurs, and there are also groups that are of concern to India. So definitely, both India and Russia have a similar objective, and we are not alone in having this objective. That that Afghanistan does not return to the tragedy that occurred almost 2 decades ago, where it becomes by design or default a safe haven for terror groups, sort of a collecting point and a staging point for international terror groups. So Russia will remain engaged from a different angle. I guess India will also remain engaged. We have grave concerns on the Jaish-e-Mohammed or the LET striking routes and being given official patronage from those who are presently in Kabul. So this is an ongoing concern, and I'm sure we will be strongly engaged on this.
Thank you. We have 2 more students. William, you're next, and we have 2 questions in the chat, and that will conclude our session today. William?
Okay. It's a pleasure to speak with you, Ambassador. I'm William Saltes. I'm a 3rd-year undergrad in the history department. And I wanted to ask you if there's been any conflict between Russia and India over Russia's Eurasian Economic Union and its expansion of power since the collapse of the USSR, or more continuing of power in the Central Asian countries.
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is we don't have any conflict of interest with Russia. In fact, we support Russia's engagement with its close partners, some of them ex-Soviet republics, now presently some of them as part of the CIS, particularly in Central Asia. We have engaged with Russia. We have also engaged with the Eurasian Economic Union. In fact, we have agreed to negotiate a free trade agreement between India and the EAEU along similar lines that the EAEU has concluded between, say, Vietnam or Singapore or other countries in the Middle East. Why is this important? Because the Eurasian landmass is really requiring new forms and new patterns of cooperation, be it in connectivity, be it in trade, digital infrastructure, health, education, you name it. We have excellent relations with each of the Central Asian states. We have excellent relations with Russia. We don't see any conflict of interest between India and Russia on this. In fact, we would wish to draw in the EAEU states into conversations that are more forward-looking, more long-term. For example, principles of connectivity. As you know, India has certain questions and reservations on China's Belt Road Initiative. That is a concern elsewhere as well, and we share those concerns. I think various platforms are required, and India is a very welcome partner in Central Asia. We are very, very welcome in, say, in the 5 Central Asian states. So the basis for working together on a common objective in creating new patterns and avenues and pathways of cooperation is something that we welcome, and the EA-EU is one such example.
Thank you. A final question on screen, Javad.
Hello, Ambassador. I'm a postgraduate student at Princeton University in Near Eastern Studies Department. And my question is about India-Turkey relations, particularly in the field of economy. Turkey has for a while situated itself as the China of Europe. And I wonder if you could speculate whether India could take that role over from China in terms of that economic relation.
Well, we have good relations with Turkey, but Turkey also has its own interests to pursue in its immediate neighborhood in the Middle East, for example, in Syria. Turkey is a new player in Afghanistan. We would wish to have commonality of interest with Turkey. Turkey is a major player, a major economic player. But I think our areas in which India's strengths and where Turkish strengths can be converged, I think are few and far between. We would very much like to have them, but presently I think Turkey is on a trajectory that we would find little common ground with India's interests. India pursues its own interests in regions that are of priority for us, or immediate neighborhood, Central Asia. We are less engaged in the Black Sea area. Obviously, that is a little distant to our interests. We have strong relations with countries in the Mediterranean, but Turkey sometimes evokes emotions and responses in its immediate neighborhood and in the Mediterranean, which of course are at variance with what we would like to see.
Thank you. We have 2 questions I promised to get to from the chat, Ambassador. One of those 2 questions involves Myanmar and Russia's embrace of Myanmar's military regime, and whether this has implications or even potential instability on the India-Myanmar border. And the second question is about the status of India-Japanese relations within the context of China's rise.
Sure. Let me answer one after the other. With respect to India's relations with Japan, let me start with the second one. India and Japan get along famously well for several reasons. Again, there has been never any conflict of interest. Japan as a country and Japanese people hold India in very high esteem for how we dealt with Japan after the Second World War. Japan has been one of the highest providers of official development assistance to India when we needed them. We needed such assistance in the past decades. Presently, we have not only a strategic partnership, it is a global strategic partnership. I don't think India-Japan relations can be confined to just the issue of dealing with China. China is a concern for a very large number of countries, but each country has its own problem, so to speak, and Japan does with respect to with China. Japan and China too have a territorial dispute with regard to some of the islands, but that has not prevented Japan and China cooperating quite extensively on trade and economic relations. So this multiplicity of objectives and pathways of cooperation is something that you need to factor in. India and Japan are also quite active members of the Quad. In fact, the Quad was first proposed by Prime Minister Abe of Japan. India and Japan also cooperate in the Russian Far East. There is a trilateral initiative, which happily began during my time. It was announced during the Vladivostok summit, where Prime Minister Modi was the chief guest at the Eastern Economic Forum. So there are, I would say, multiplicity of incentives and drivers of policy. But I have a very positive view of our relations with Japan. Technology, infrastructure development is something that we can work on. Pardon me, I lost track of the first question.
It was about Russia's embrace of the military regime in Myanmar.
Yeah,
and
sure.
whether this has consequences for India, including potential instability on the border with Myanmar.
Yeah, well, if you ask our Russian interlocutors in Moscow, they say that their embrace is not really an embrace. They have not shut the door like other countries, especially from Europe or the United States. They say that Russia is only continuing to engage with who is in power in Myanmar, and in this flip-flops that have occurred in Western approach to Myanmar is something that they would not follow. Of course, there is this example of a deputy foreign minister sitting in splendid isolation before a Myanmar military parade, and that is being shown as evidence of Russia reaching out to Myanmar during its period of isolation. The Russian explanation is that there was a long-standing invitation, and they just sort of decided to avail of it. However, Russia is a little distant from Myanmar. They have, in policy terms, supported the ASEAN initiative for dialogue. The ASEAN initiative for dialogue also has a special envoy. So Russia is fully supportive of ASEAN efforts to re-engage with Myanmar with the final objective of the return of democracy in Myanmar, which is not very dissimilar to India's objectives. We do wish to have a process that will restore democracy in Myanmar. We don't see a threat of Russian engagement in Myanmar. I mean, it is on the border between India and Myanmar. Russia has almost no role, but it is the larger process of providing incentives and the possibilities for Myanmar to remain stable, to become inclusive again, to restore democracy, and to see development return to that rather troubled country.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Our time is up at this point. Your masterclass in the articulation and promotion of Indian national interests will live a long time in the memory here at Princeton University. In conclusion, I'd just like to ask if you have any parting words for us, and I'd like to thank you so much for your time today.
Well, it's been a great honor and a pleasure, Professor Kotkin. If I may share with others, my team here was looking at a secret way of giving me a farewell present. They were looking for your third volume. They finally realized that the third volume was a couple of years away. But that search for your third volume led, of course, to this fantastic evening that we've had the privilege of sharing with you and your very bright students. That said, I'm, of course, as I said, I'm looking at the dawn of freedom in 3 days' time. And on top of my checklist will be this publication date. The second volume was called Waiting for Hitler. In my view, Waiting for Kotkin is very high on my retirement checklist. So thank you very much for allowing us to spend time with you and your students today.
We're in your debt, Ambassador, and you'll be among the first to receive Volume 3. I give you my assurance. Anyway, please join me in thanking the Ambassador with our silent clapping. And We wish you well in your next endeavor, and we thank you so much for your time today. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Ambassador. Okay.